doing team leading on a few big projects in Czech Republic. We have like our local version of Uber Eats, and it's pretty big. And I've been doing Java for the past 2 years. And I'm doing trainings for Git and testing and how to correctly use ORM. And so let's jump right in. Why would we want to use value objects in PHP? So first of all, how many of you are using PHP that is before 7.1? Keep your hands up if somebody of you is using older PHP, 7.1 or older. Okay, so PHP 5.6 and 7.0 are basically dead. In a month, you have end of security support, so you have to upgrade now. And with the upgrade to at least PHP 7.1, because PHP 7.0 doesn't count, you'll get a few advantages, because there is better support for type hinting in PHP 7.1, and with better type hinting, you can use static types better in PHP. Because PHP is a dynamic language, it's not compiled, you get the errors about types that the methods you are calling are accepting different type than you are passing them. You'll get that in runtime, which is bad. But if you define correctly the types and document them properly, you can use static analysis tools like PHP Stan. How many of you know about PHP Stan? Nice. PHP Stan verifies that your entire code base uses types that fit together and many other things. There is a lot of static analysis checks that help you find bugs. And you should go and run this tool in your code base right now, and you'll see how many bugs you have there you didn't even know about, just because you are using it wrongly, or somewhere you are passing the wrong type or wrong variable. So with static typing, you get a lot of advantages, but you have to actually use them right. You can just add type hints to methods with integer and string and call it like static typing. No, that's very weak, very basic static typing. Let's look at an example. Let's take some form component from some generic framework. So you have form, you submit it, and then you get values from the form. And one of the values is email. So take the email, save it in a local variable, and pass it to your model. And your model accepts the email, does something with it, and then passes it to the user entity, and then it saves the user entity to database. So that's fine, right? That's pretty basic standard thing. So with PHP 7.1, you say this is a string, which is nice, because then you can pass there a boolean or integer or other object. But the problem is with this that there is no information declaring that it's actually an email. It's just the name of a variable. It doesn't say it's an email. You are hoping somebody who's calling your method is passing an email. So that means you have to validate it. I have to validate it everywhere where you are accepting the email. Because if you are not doing it, you are relying on hope that somebody passes you an email. Every time you accept an email, you have to validate it. Otherwise, you have no guarantee. And this is obviously wrong, right? There's a lot of duplication of logic. You don't want to do that. So the problem is HTTP is a bunch of strings, and this is the default, right? And you want to take the strings and create something meaningful from them. So in this example, I'll take the email address and I'll create a value object for the email. It's just a class with one property, email, private constructor, so you can just create it with any value, but it has a static factory function. And if you call it the email address from string with the email, it does the validation, some validation that I need to, takes the email address, passes it to the object, and returns you a validated object that represents the email. And now every time you work with object of type email address, you know it contains a valid address. You don't have to validate it again. So to get there, you have to have the private constructor ideally, and some factory methods, because you might want to create the email from different values. So there can be more, and then you get the always valid object that every time you work with the email, with the value object, you know it contains valid object. And because you have the validation only in one place, you don't have to duplicate it anywhere. So now I take the same logic, same form, I take the email, I wrap it in the email address, and I pass the email to my model, and my model now accepts email address as an object. And now I know it's safe to accept the email address, and I don't have to validate it again, because there's no way to create email address unless it's valid. This is strict typing. Let's look at another example. Let's figure out some generic drawing board.
Sorry, what? I'm sorry. What happens if the email is not validated?
Okay.
I mean, at that point.
Yeah, here you would throw an exception.
Yeah,
that's it. Right here.
Okay.
If you are passing the value from the form, ideally the form itself contains the validation that the email is valid. So the exception never raises. Okay. But if you were to put in a wrong email, invalid email, it would raise the exception.
Understood.
But now, thanks to validation in form, it doesn't. So now we have the guarantee. Is that okay? So now let's look at another example. There's some drawing board, and it draws a pixel of some color. So it accepts the coordinates, and it accepts the color in RGB format. But if you look at it, it just accepts a bunch of numbers, and if you mix them, not only it will still work, but it will work in the wrong way, but you will never know about it, because it didn't throw any exception. It's still a valid integer. You can just switch them around, and it will still do something. It just won't do the thing you want. So this API with the integers, with the ints, just ints, it doesn't prevent any like stupid mistakes, like you switch variables because you don't know the order. Like the IDE will help you with some of it, but not with everything, and you can still make this mistake even with good IDE. And the problem is this works even if you mix the arguments. You might even argue that the 5 arguments is too many, or that the variable names are badly named, and most of all, because you are accepting 3 integers, you have to validate them. You have to validate that all of them represent a valid value for one of the RGB integers. So instead of accepting 5 integers, let's accept object of coordinates and object of color. And how do we create them? Coordinates is just some object that can validate that it's valid latitude and longitude, or pixel, sorry, that is valid pixel or something. Coordinates, like it's not float or something. And then the color, we have another factory method from RGB, and the from RGB validates that the integer is between 0 and 255, I think. So it does it for all of them, and you know that when you create it, you have a valid RGB value for the color, and we have valid representation of the color, and now we can just use it. This is strictly typed, so nicer API, and it nice APIs prefer domain concepts, object of domain concepts over primitives. So I accept color, I don't accept 3 integers. And also it's self-documenting, because if you look at it, this just reads very nicer than 5 integers. So value objects can have behavior, which means you can have some operations. You don't have to just wrap the value and create a getter for it so you can take it out again. You can create behavior on the objects. For example, if you have color, it might make sense to invert the values of the color, but you don't want to create a, you might want to create a function, but it's better to create the method on the color itself, because the color is already validated, it knows the state, and you can just do the operation and return the inverted color, or some other operation that you can think of. Just what makes sense. And what is nice about it, that if you were to implement this function in your code, like you are calling it, you'll be just subtracting some integers from some variables, but now you are calling nice method in your model. So this improves readability. Another thing with value objects is that they are defined by their state, by the value they hold. And for example, these two colors hold the same RGB values. So if you compare them, they are equal. That's the property of the value object. But this is like stupid. You don't want to write code like this. So you contain it in a method that defines the behavior again, and you can nicely compare the colors, and you always know if it's the same color. You are not comparing some integer, you are comparing colors. Also, in contrast with that, there's another object property that value objects shouldn't have. You shouldn't rely on value object identity. If you look at this code, it's pretty obvious those colors won't be identical and that the assert will pass. That's pretty obvious. But there are cases where you want that to be true. For example, when you have user in your system is one object, one instance that is defined by the existence. There's some guy named John, and there's only one of him. So there's only one of him in your application, and only one object that represents him. So if you are working with him and get the object from different places, they should be identical. So that's the difference. Value objects don't hold the identity necessarily. Value objects should be also ideally immutable, which means that when you are doing some operation on them that would change their internal state, you want to create new object that contains the new state. You don't mutate the original object, you create new one. Which means that when you call the invert color invert, it creates new objects and it has different identity, which means it's a whole other object. This prevents whole kinds of bugs, which is also the reason why PHP started introducing immutable variants of some of its internal classes. There's been a datetime class for a long time, and a few years ago, there's been introduced datetime immutable. So if in your application somewhere you are using datetime, you should probably slowly migrate to datetime immutable, because that will help you find bugs that you didn't even know about, because you were using the mutable variant. Few ideas for value objects. What can be a value object? There's, for example, no concept of time or date in PHP. Everyone now uses just date time that has stripped time for zeros, and that's a date. That's not a date. That's date time on midnight. Have a proper type for the date. For example, there's a library, Brick date time on GitHub, that has nicely modeled time and date concepts. From the new Java 8 APIs. They have really nice API for the datetime, and PHP just doesn't have it, so there's no reason not to use it. Also, another concept that is very good to model in object is money. You never want to work with money in floats. That's obvious, right? But you even don't want to work with money in integers. You want to work with money in money object. You want to have a concept of money with currency. So you can just you can't call, for example, summary on them. You can take one money object in one currency, another money object in another currency, and you sum them. No, it will throw an exception. First convert it to the right currency, and then you can sum it. This is one of the things that value objects help you with. Also, email address, we've already seen. Phone number can be value object. URL, you just don't. Why would you pass URL as a string, right? You can have a nice object for it. Date time, date range, time range, number range. Those are very useful because you have pair or of something. Like in the example with the RGB, you are not passing three integers. You are passing two dates that belong together. They define a range. That's like a domain concept for you that you should be working with instead of two arguments. Also, for example, pulse loaders. So to sum it up, value object define a concept of your domain. For example, you have something in your application that is a concept. It's a color, coordinate, email, something, and you model it using the value object, and you make it nicely usable using by defining some methods on it, some operations. It's defined by values, not by identity. So ideally, we want to have the equals operator, and it has to be valid from the moment you create it. You can never create a value object in an invalid state. It has to be validated from the first millisecond. They should be preferably immutable. There might be cases where it makes sense to make it mutable, but there are very few of them, and they should probably have some behavior. And just to confuse you a bit more, value objects are often confused with the term data transfer object or entity. Those are separate concepts for a whole other talk. I won't go into it, but just know that if you're interested in it, value object is not data transfer object and value object is not entity. Those are different concepts. And that's all from me. So if you have any questions.
Yeah, what's the extreme for working with value objects? For example, a description, a name. Would you map that to value objects, or what's? Because you can go, you know.
Yeah, you can do that. You can like create types for individual IDs of entities. You have like entity user, and you define type user ID. So it's like, okay, it might make sense, but you have to first decide for yourself if in your application you have any benefit from it. For example, for me, the rule of thumb is if you have some concept that you need to validate, that's not just like simple assertion of type, like if you take the name of the user, if you can just assert that it's just not empty, it might be silly to create a whole object for it, because you just care if the name is not empty. You don't care if like it's 3 or 4 symbols, because that will be also silly, because you might have some customers that have 3-letter number, which is not uncommon. That's like normal. So for the name, you have the validation that it's just not empty, and it might not make sense to create a concept for it, like the value object. But for me, the value object makes sense when you need to validate something that is not completely trivial, and or when you need some behavior. For example, if I take the color and I want to have some operations with colors on RGB, like the invert or transparent, then it makes also sense to create the value object. So I hope that answers. Any more questions?
Yeah, maybe a stupid question, but how would you save the data to database in case of? I mean, are you just going to create your own methods to saving data into the database?
Yeah,
or maybe serialize one of these objects and save it whatever in the database.
There's if you have the objects, you are constrained by the tool you use for the database communication. For example, I use a lot Doctrine ORM. So Doctrine,
I'm talking maybe about money or dates or so. No, so
they have 2 values.
Yeah, that have more.
Yeah, okay, that's the same case. You can have, if it's a simple case, you just define a class that is a converter that can take the value and the value object and create a value from it, and the value then is saved to the database. And then when you are loading it, you define the opposite operation. So you take the value, wrap it in the value object, and put it in the entity. So that's a simple case, right? But there are more complex case, like with the money. So you can have that's a pair of values, and you can't easily save pair of values into a database. For example, I think Postgres can do it. You can define a composite type for Postgres, so you should be able to like directly save composite type like money and currency together in one column, but that just complicates the queries and disables the DQL capabilities. So I would prefer to define a border on the entity. Like if you, I'm doing this often myself, if you take some value object into the entity and you need to save it differently than it's represented in the rest of the model, I take the money, I split it up to number value, which is the price, and currency, which currency is also itself an object. So I put them separately into 2 fields of the entity, but I don't create 2 getters for the money and the currency. I create 1 getter that also, that again takes those 2 values, creates the valid money object with the price and the currency, and then return it. I don't expose this detail. It's like an implementation detail of the entity. So I take the valid value object, I accept it, I do whatever I must with it, and then I return again a valid value object. If I can solve it on the ORM layer or the debug layer, whatever you're using, or if I can't, I can just solve it in the object itself, and the fact that it's in 2 fields, it's implementation detail. Does it make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
I wanted to add to him that there's also in Doctrine like embeddables, but they are kind of buggy, so that's another option that you can.
Yeah, embeddables are nice, but they have to have nullable order fields, which takes away some power from the database, which you might not want to do.
That's right. Thanks.
There's a question there.
Do you make unit testing for your value object?
That's a great question, because you have the concept and some operation defined on one place. If you unit test it and use it throughout your code base, you know that this one operation is always correct because you've tested it. So that's a very good point. You should always write unit tests for your value object, and because they should be usually like simple and default persistence, you usually don't even need mocking. You just write the unit test for them. That's very nice.
I have a case that I have seen in some place. For the email value added, for example, you would like to have a validation that the domain name of that email address is.
Yeah, I see very
an
good.
LX record.
I see very good.
So you are
Yeah.
you are
So-
not able to check that.
So if it's not some simple validation you can do with some ifs and comparisons, you like have to do network round trips or database calls or something else to really validate the value object. It's a bit more complicated, but usually you can get away with creating a separate service that's a factory for the value object, and you create the value object using that service. So you won't be able to like create it using the static factory, but I think even Symfony might have something like this, because they have a service for validating that the email has valid domain, and you can use the Symfony validator to check that this is actually okay. So you won't be, in cases like this, I don't think there's much of them, but there are some, they are valid. In cases like this, you wouldn't be using the static factory pattern. That's like the simple case. You would be using some object with like create method or something, and you would do the validation there. It's a bit harder to guarantee the object is created only there, because you don't have like the friends construct in C++ or package private construct from Java. So you in PHP that would be a bit harder. You would have to rely on the contract with your colleagues, like they won't abuse it. Like don't you just write some documentation. Never instantiate this. You always use this class. So you'd have to like cover it in code review and like the best practices of your company. But that's still doable. That's I think fine. Yeah, okay, you can use star reflection probably. But I'd go with it like the last resort.
There is a little holy war in internet about value object. Need they have setters or no? How do you think?
Setters on value objects?
Yes, because some people say what value object don't